Chapter 15, Forest Ascetic. Master Udaka was 75 years old. He was venerated by all as though he were a living god. Udaka required all new disciples to begin at the most elementary levels of practice. So Siddhartha began again with the simplest meditation techniques. But in just a few weeks, he demonstrated to his new teacher that he had already attained to the realm of no materiality, and Master Udaka was impressed. He saw in this young man of noble bearing a potential spiritual heir, and he taught Siddhartha with utmost care. Monk Siddhartha Gautama, in the state of no materiality, emptiness is no longer the same as empty space, nor is it what is usually called consciousness. All that remains are perception and the object of perception. Thus, the path to liberation is to transcend all perception. Siddhartha respectfully asked, "Master, if one eliminates perception, what is left? If there is no perception, how do we differ from a piece of wood or a rock?" A piece of wood or a rock is not without perception. Inanimate objects are themselves perception. You must arrive at a state of consciousness in which both perception and non-perception are eliminated. This is the state of neither perception nor non-perception. Young man, you must now attain that state. Siddhartha left to return to his meditation. In just 15 days, he realized the samadhi called neither perception nor non-perception. Siddhartha saw that this state allowed one to transcend all ordinary states of consciousness. But whenever he came out of this meditative state, he saw that in spite of its extraordinariness, it did not provide a solution to the problem of life and death. It was a most peaceful state to dwell in, but it was not the key to unlock reality. When Siddhartha returned to Master Udaka Ramaputta, the master praised him highly. He grasped Siddhartha's hand and said, "Monk Gautama, you are the best student I have ever had. You have made enormous progress in such a short time. You have attained the highest level I have. I am old and not long for this world. If you will remain here, we can guide this community together. And when I die, you can take my place as master of the community." Once again, Siddhartha politely declined. He knew that the state of neither perception nor non-perception was not the key to liberation from birth and death, and that he had to move on. He expressed his deepest gratitude to the master and to the community of monks and took his leave. Everyone had come to love Siddhartha, and all were sad to see him go. During his stay at Udaka Ramaputta's center, Siddhartha made friends with a young monk named Kondana. Kondana was very fond of Siddhartha and regarded him as a teacher as well as a good friend. No one else in the community except Siddhartha had attained the state of no materiality, not to mention the state of neither perception nor non-perception. Kondana knew that the master considered Siddhartha worthy to be his spiritual heir. Just looking at Siddhartha gave Kondana faith in his own practice. He often approached Siddhartha to learn from him, and a special bond grew between them. Kondana regretted his friend's departure. He accompanied Siddhartha down the mountain and waited until he was no longer in sight before returning back up the mountain. Siddhartha had accomplished so much with the masters reputed to be the two best meditation teachers in the land, and yet the fundamental issue of liberation from suffering was still burning inside him. He realized that he probably would not be able to learn much more from any of the other teacher sages throughout the land, and so he knew that he had to seek the key to enlightenment on his own. Walking slowly west, between rice fields and across a long stretch of muddy lagoons and streams, Siddhartha reached the Neranjara River. He waded across it and walked until he reached Dangsiri Mountain, half a day's walk from Uruvela village. The steep and rocky slopes ended in saw-toothed peaks and concealed many caves. Boulders as large as the homes of poor villagers perched on the mountainside. Siddhartha resolved to remain here until he discovered the way of liberation. He found a cave in which he could sit in meditation for long hours, and while sitting he reviewed all the practices he had done for what was now more than 5 years. He remembered how he had advised the ascetics not to abuse their bodies, telling them that they would only add to the suffering of a world already filled with suffering. But now, as he considered their path more carefully, he thought to himself, "You can't make a fire with soft, wet wood. The body is the same. If physical desires are not mastered, it is difficult for the heart to attain enlightenment. I will practice self-mortification in order to attain liberation." Thus, the monk Gautama began a period of extreme asceticism. On dark nights, he entered the deepest and most wild reaches of the forest, the mere thought of which was enough to make a person's hair stand on end. And there he remained throughout the night. Even as fear and panic engulfed his mind and body, he sat without stirring. And when a deer approached with its rustling sounds, his fear told him that there were demons coming to kill him, but he did not budge. When a peacock broke a piece of dead twig, his fear told him it was a python coming down from a tree. Yet he still did not move, even as fear shot through him like the sting of red ants. He tried to overcome all physical fears. He believed that once his body was no longer enslaved by fear, his mind would break the chains of suffering. Sometimes he sat with his teeth clenched while pressing his tongue against the roof of his mouth, using his willpower to suppress all fear and horror. Even when he broke into a cold sweat and his whole body became drenched, he did not move. At other times, he held his breath for long stretches until a roar like thunder or a blazing furnace pounded in his ears, and his head felt as though someone had taken an axe and cleaved it in two. Sometimes he felt as though his head was being squeezed by a steel band and his stomach slashed open like a goat's by a butcher. And at times he felt as if his body was being roasted over an open fire. Through these austere practices, he was able to consolidate his courage and discipline, and his body was able to endure unspeakable pain, but his heart was still without peace. The monk Gautama practiced austerities in this way for 6 months. For the first 3 of these months, he was alone on the mountain, but during the 4th month, he was discovered by 5 disciples of Master Ramaputta, led by his old friend Kondana. Siddhartha was happy to see Kondana again, and he found out that just 1 month after Siddhartha left the meditation center, Kondana himself had attained the state of neither perception nor non-perception. Seeing there was nothing more he could learn from Master Uddaka, Kondana persuaded 4 friends to join him in seeking Siddhartha. After several weeks, they were lucky enough to find him, and they expressed their desire to stay and practice with him. Siddhartha explained to them why he was exploring the path of self-mortification, and the 5 young men, Kondana, Vapa, Badaya, Asaji, and Mahanama, resolved to join him. Each monk found a cave to live in, not far from one another, and every day one of them went into town to beg for food. When he returned, the food was divided into 6 portions, so that none of them had more than a small handful each day. Days and months went by, and the 6 monks grew thin and gaunt. They left the mountain and moved east towards the village of Uruvela, on the bank of the Neranjara, and continued to practice in the same way. But Siddhartha's austerities began to alarm even his 5 companions, and they found it impossible to keep up with him. Siddhartha ceased bathing in the river, or even taking his share of the food. On some days he ate just a shriveled guava he happened to find on the ground, or a piece of dried buffalo manure. His body had become terribly wasted. It was little more than loose flesh hanging on protruding bones. He had not cut his hair or beard in 6 months, and when he rubbed his head, handfuls of hair fell out, as though there were no longer any space for it to grow on the bit of flesh still clinging to his skull. And then, one day, while practicing sitting meditation in a cemetery, Siddhartha realized with a jolt how wrong the practice of self-mortification was. The sun had set, and a cool breeze gently caressed his skin. After sitting all day beneath the blazing sun, the breeze was delightfully refreshing, and Siddhartha experienced an ease in his mind unlike anything he had felt during the day. He realized that body and mind formed one reality which could not be separated. The peace and comfort of the body were directly related to the peace and comfort of the mind. To abuse the body was to abuse the mind. He remembered the first time he sat in meditation when he was 9 years old, beneath the cool shade of a rose apple tree on the day of the year's first ploughing. He remembered how the refreshing ease of that sitting had brought him a sense of clarity and calm. He recalled as well his meditation in the forest right after Channa had left him. He thought back to his first days with Master Alara Kalama. Those initial sessions of meditation had nourished both body and mind, creating in him a deep ability to concentrate and focus. But after that, Master Alara Kalama had told him to transcend the joys of meditation in order to attain to states that existed beyond the material world. States such as the realms of limitless space and limitless consciousness, and the state of no materiality. Later, there had been the state of neither perception nor non-perception. Always the goal had been to find a means to escape the world of feeling and thought, the world of sensation and perception. He asked himself, why follow only the traditions laid down in scripture? Why fear the joyful ease that meditation brings? Such joys have nothing in common with the 5 categories of desire which obscure awareness. To the contrary, the joys of meditation can nourish body and mind and provide the strength needed to pursue the path of enlightenment. The monk Gautama resolved to regain his health and to use his meditation to nourish both body and mind. He would beg for food again, starting the next morning. He would be his own teacher, not depending on the teachings of anyone else. Happy with this decision, he stretched out on a mound of earth and peacefully drifted off to sleep. The full moon had just risen in a cloudless sky, and the Milky Way stretched clear and radiant across the heavens. The monk Gautama awoke the next morning to the sound of birds singing. He stood up and recalled his decisions of the previous night. He was covered with dirt and dust, and his robe was so tattered and threadbare it no longer covered his body. He remembered seeing a corpse in the cemetery the day before, and he guessed that today or tomorrow people would lift it down to the river to perform the cremation ceremony, and the brick-coloured cloth that covered it would no longer be needed. He approached the corpse, and reflecting quietly on birth and death, he respectfully removed the cloth from the body. The corpse was that of a young woman, her body swollen and discoloured. Siddhartha would use the brick-coloured cloth as a new robe. He walked to the river to bathe himself, and at the same time to wash the cloth. The water was cool, and Siddhartha found it overwhelmingly refreshing. He enjoyed the pleasant feeling of the water on his skin, welcoming the sensation with a new state of mind. He took a long time bathing, and then he scrubbed and wrung out his new robe. But as he went to climb out of the water, his strength failed him. He did not have enough energy to pull himself onto the bank. He stood quietly and breathed calmly. To one side he saw a tree branch leaning over the water, its leaves skimming the surface. He walked towards it slowly and grabbed onto it to support himself while he climbed out of the water. He sat down to rest on the riverbank as the sun climbed higher into the sky. He spread out the cloth to dry in the hot sun, and when the cloth was dry, Siddhartha wrapped it around himself and set out for the village of Uruvela. But before he had walked even halfway, his strength failed him, and, unable to catch his breath, he collapsed. He lay unconscious for some time before a young girl from the village appeared. 13-year-old Sujata had been sent by her mother to carry rice milk, cakes, and lotus seeds to offer to the forest gods. When she saw the monk lying unconscious on the road, barely breathing, she knelt down and placed a bowl of milk to his lips. She knew he was an ascetic who had fainted from weakness. When the drops of milk moistened his tongue and throat, Siddhartha responded immediately. He could taste how refreshing the milk was, and he slowly drank the entire bowlful. After a few dozen breaths, he was revived enough to sit up, and he motioned Siddhartha to pour him another bowlful of milk. It was remarkable how quickly the milk restored his strength. That day, he decided to abandon austerity practice and go to the cool forest across the river to practice there. During the days that followed, he gradually began to eat and drink normally. Sometimes Sujata brought him food offerings. Sometimes he took his bowl into the village to beg. Every day, he practiced walking meditation along the riverbank, and the rest of the time he devoted to sitting meditation. Every evening, he bathed in the Neranjara River. He abandoned all reliance on tradition and scripture in order to find the way on his own. He returned to himself to learn from his own successes and failures. He did not hesitate to let meditation nourish his mind and body, and a sense of peace and ease grew within him. He did not distance himself or try to escape his feelings and perceptions, but maintained mindfulness in order to observe them as they arose. He abandoned the desire to escape the world of phenomena, and as he returned to himself, he found he was completely present to the world of phenomena. One breath, one bird's song, one leaf, one ray of sunlight, any of these might serve as a subject of his meditation. He began to see that the key to liberation lay in each breath, each step, each small pebble along the path. The monk Gautama went from meditating on his body to meditating on his feelings, and from meditating on his feelings to meditating on his perceptions, including all the thoughts which rose and fell in his own mind. He saw the oneness of body and mind, that each and every cell of the body contained all the wisdom of the universe. He saw that he needed only to look deeply into a speck of dust to see the true face of the entire universe, and that the speck of dust was itself the universe. And if it did not exist, the universe could not exist either. The monk Gautama went beyond the idea of a separate self, of Atman, and with a start realized that he had long been dominated by a false view of Atman, as expounded in the Vedas. In reality, all things were without a separate self. Non-self, or anatman, was the nature of all existence. Anatman was not a term to describe some new entity. It was a thunderbolt that destroyed all wrong views. Taking hold of non-self, Siddhartha was like a general raising his sharp sword of insight on the battlefield of meditation practice. Day and night, he sat beneath the pippala tree as new levels of awareness awoke in him like bright flashes of lightning. During this time, Siddhartha's 5 friends lost faith in him. They saw him sitting along the riverbank eating food offerings. They watched him speak and smile to a young girl, enjoy milk and rice, and carry his bowl down into the village. Kondana said to the others, "Siddhartha is no longer someone we can rely on. He has abandoned the path halfway. He now concerns himself only with idly feeding his body. We should leave him and seek another place to continue our practice. I see no reason to continue here." Only after his 5 friends had departed did Siddhartha notice their absence. Encouraged by his new insights, Siddhartha had devoted all his time to meditation and had not yet taken the time to explain this to his friends. He thought, "My friends have misunderstood me, but I can't worry now about convincing them otherwise. I must devote myself to finding the true path. Once I have found it, I will share it with them." Then he returned to his daily practice. During these same days in which he made such great progress along the path, the young buffalo boy, Svasti, appeared. Siddhartha cheerfully accepted the handfuls of fresh grass the 11-year-old boy offered him. Though Sujata, Svasti, and their friends were still children, Siddhartha shared with them some of his new understanding. He was happy to see how unschooled children from the countryside could easily understand his discoveries. He was greatly heartened, for he knew that the door of complete enlightenment would soon open wide. He knew he held the wondrous key, the truth of the interdependent and non-self nature of all things. Chapter 16. Was Yasodhara sleeping? Because he was from a poor family, Svasti had, of course, never gone to school. Sujata taught him a few basics, but he still lacked skill with words, and while recounting his story about the Buddha, he sometimes halted, unable to find the right words. His listeners assisted him. In addition to Ananda and Rahula, 2 others came to listen to his story. One was an elderly nun named Master Pajapati, and the other was a monk in his early 40s named Ascetic. Rahula introduced them both to Svasti, who was deeply touched to learn that Maha Pajapati was herself Queen Gautami, the Buddha's aunt who had raised him from infancy. She was the first woman to be accepted as a nun in the Buddha's Sangha, and she now served as abbess to more than 700 nuns. She had just travelled from the north to visit the Buddha and to consult him concerning precepts for the bhikkhunis. Svasti learned that she had arrived only the previous evening, and her grandson Rahula, knowing how much she would enjoy hearing all Svasti had to say about the Buddha's days in Uruvela forest, had invited her to join them. Svasti placed his palms together and bowed low before the abbess, remembering all the Buddha had told him about her, filled his heart with deep affection and respect. Maha Pajapati looked at Svasti with the same loving warmth as she looked at her own grandson Rahula. Rahula introduced Asaji to Svasti, and Svasti's eyes lit up when he learned that Asaji was one of the 5 friends who had practiced self-mortification with the Buddha near Svasti's own home. The Buddha had told him back then that when his friends saw he had abandoned austerities to drink milk and eat rice, they left him to practice elsewhere. Svasti wondered how Asaji had come to be of the Buddha's disciples, living right here at Bamboo Forest Monastery. He would ask Rahula about it later. Bhikkhuni Gautami assisted Svasti the most in his efforts to tell his tale. She asked questions about details that didn't seem important to him, but were of obvious interest to her. She asked where he had cut the kusa grass he offered the Buddha for a meditation cushion, and how often he had provided new bundles of grass for the Buddha. She wanted to know if, after giving the Buddha the grass, the buffaloes still had enough to eat at night. And she asked if he was ever beaten by the buffalo's owner. Much remained to be told, but Svasti asked permission to stop there for the evening and promised to continue the following day. But before taking his leave, he wondered if he could ask Bhikkhuni Gautami a few questions he had held in his heart for 10 years. She smiled at him and said, "Go ahead and ask. If I am able to answer your questions, I will be most happy to." There were several things Svasti wanted to know. First of all, had Yasodhara really been sleeping, or only pretending to be asleep the night Siddhartha pulled back the curtain before his departure? Svasti also wanted to know what the king, queen, and Yasodhara thought and said when Channa returned with Siddhartha's sword, necklace, and locks of hair. What happened in the lives of the Buddha's family in the 6 years of his absence? Who first heard the news that the Buddha had attained the way? Who first welcomed the Buddha back? And did all the city come out and greet him when he returned to Kapilavatthu? "You do have a lot of questions," exclaimed Bhikkhuni Gautami. She smiled kindly at Svasti. "Let me try to answer them briefly. First of all, was Yasodhara truly asleep or not? If you want to know for certain, you should ask Yasodhara. But if you ask me, I don't believe she was. Yasodhara herself had prepared Siddhartha's garments, hat, and shoes, and placed them on his chair. She told Channa to saddle and ready Kantanka. She knew that the prince would leave that very night. How could she be asleep on such a night? I believe she only pretended to be asleep in order to avoid a painful parting for Siddhartha and herself. You do not yet know Yasodhara, Svasti, but Rahula's mother is a woman of great determination. She understood Siddhartha's intent and quietly gave him her wholehearted support. I know this more clearly than anyone else, for of all those close to Yasodhara, I was the closest next to Siddhartha. Bhikkhuni Gautama told Svasti that the following morning, when it was discovered that Siddhartha had left, everyone, except Yasodhara, was in a state of shock. King Suddhodana flew into a rage and yelled at everyone, blaming them for not preventing the prince from leaving. Queen Gautama ran at once to find Yasodhara. She found her sitting quietly and weeping. Official search parties were sent out on horseback in all 4 directions, with orders to return with the prince if they found him. The southbound party met Channa, returning with the riderless Kantankaka. Channa stopped them from going any further. He said, "Leave the prince in peace to follow his spiritual path. I have already wept and pleaded with him, but he is intent on seeking the way. Anyway, he has entered the deep forests which lie in another country's territory. You cannot seek him there." When Channa returned to the palace, he lowered his head to the ground 3 times as a sign of remorse, and took the sword, necklace, and locks of hair to give to the king. At that moment, Queen Gautama and Yasodhara were by the king's side. Seeing Channa's tears, the king did not rebuke him, but slowly asked about all that had taken place. He told Channa to give the sword, necklace, and hair to Yasodhara for safekeeping. The atmosphere in the palace was dreary. Losing the prince was like losing the light of day. The king retired to his quarters and refused to come out for many days. His minister, Vesamita, was obliged to handle all palace matters on his behalf. After being returned to his stall, Kantaka refused to eat or drink. Bhikkhuni Gautama had recounted events up to that point when the bell for meditation rang. Everyone looked disappointed, but Ananda said they should not skip meditation, no matter how good the stories were. He invited them all to return the following day to his hut. Svasti and Rahula joined their palms and bowed to Bhikkhuni Gautama, Ananda, and Asaji before returning to the hut of their teacher, Sariputta. The 2 young friends walked side by side without speaking. The slow reverberations of the bell gained momentum, like waves breaking one upon another. Svasti followed his breath and silently recited the Gatha for hearing the bell. Listen, listen, this wonderful sound brings me back to my true self. And that, dear friends, is where we leave our story this evening. Rest well and good night.